Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the White House. We are really excited to be here joining you just after the President's speech, which I hope a lot of you had a chance to watch from the beginning. My name is Macon Phillips, and I'm joined today by Brian Deese from the National Economic Council, who's here to take some of your questions. And before we get started, I just want to thank the folks at YouTube, youtube.com/citizentube, where they streamed the speech and also took in a lot of ideas through their site. And we're going to pull some of the popular ideas from there and questions from there to try to give you a little bit more in-depth sense of what the President was talking about. But before we move on to that, Brian, why don't you sort of kick things off by giving an overview for those of watching that may have come late to the speech about what the President tried to lay out today?
Sure, and thank you all for tuning in. I think what you heard the President talk about today was three basic things. He laid out his vision for the kind of government that we want and need in this country. A government based on the principles of shared responsibility for shared prosperity, where we have an innovative private sector that creates jobs and is more effective at innovation than any other country in the world, but a country where we also take care of the most vulnerable and have a commitment to our seniors, people with disabilities, the poor, and people who are struggling, and that commitment should be renewed and stronger. Second, he talked a little bit about how that vision contrasts with some of the proposals that we have seen come from the House Republicans in recent weeks. There are two very contrasting visions, and the President talked about how the Republican vision of cutting government down to a size where we have to let go of our values and also potentially forego economic growth and job creation was one that he thought didn't reflect the kind of America that he believed we could be. And then the third thing he did was he laid out in some specifics his approach to bringing our country's deficit down and living within our means. And a big part of having an economy that can actually be driven forward is looking for ways to bring down our deficits, bring down our debt, as part of a sensible and a balanced approach. And so I think what you heard from the President today was an approach to cut $4 trillion from our deficit over the next 12 years in a balanced way, in a sensible way, and one that is very focused on how to live within our means while continuing to increase our economy's competitiveness and create jobs.
Great. Well, let's start it off with what looked to be the most popular idea in the system that drills in on a specific issue. We spend, it comes from Black Hawk Development in Arizona. We spend $40 million per day to fight in the war. That's $14 billion a year. It needs to stop.
Well, it's a good point, and in fact, I think if anything, the amount of money that we spend on overseas contingency operations is actually more than that $14 billion. But the point still holds that our commitments overseas are a substantial drain on the resources of our government. I think what the President said today was, on the one hand, as the Commander-in-Chief, he has no greater responsibility than ensuring the safety and protection of American citizens, and that's not something that he's going to sacrifice, and he's not going to accept cuts that would put us in harm's way. But I think that what his budget and what the proposal that he outlined today suggest is that as we look at really serious ways to cut back, no area of the budget can be spared. And so that means that we have to look across every area, including our defense and security budget, and say, what are the things that we can do without? Where is their waste? Where is their inefficiency? And in the area of security, the President is focused on two things. The first is ramping down our overseas operations. You've seen that in Iraq, the President made a commitment to successfully wind down that operation, and that's happening. And likewise in Afghanistan, he set out a set of concrete targets that he intends to meet. As that happens, we will generate substantial budgetary savings, as goes to the questioner. That savings actually isn't part of the $4 trillion plan. We already assume that in our budget, and so we're not trying to double count that savings. What the President did say as part of this $4 trillion package was that he has asked Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen to go back and conduct a very thorough review, and has set a goal of saving an additional $400 billion out of our base security budget over the next 12 years. That review will happen on an expedited basis, and the President made clear that he's not going to designate specific cuts until that review is complete, because it is incredibly important for our national security that we do this right and we do it in a sensible way. But overall, I think we agree with the questioner that we have got to figure out more creative ways to be more aggressive at reining in spending, and that includes in our security budget.
Okay. The next one was a very common theme in a lot of the questions, but sums it up pretty well. This is from R3K Law, and the idea really is don't cut the budget, fix the tax loopholes that have corporations stealing billions of dollars in taxes. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that I think that the question of taxes generally is a really important one in the context of what kind of government we want. And obviously, there are two sides of the ledger, and the amount that the government invests and spends is a function of how much we bring in taxes. I think that what you heard from the President today was that we have to have a conversation, a serious conversation, about reforming our tax code, and that if we're going to get serious about fiscal discipline in this country, a discussion about tax revenue has to be part of the process. Now, you've heard some in the Republican Party say that all taxes just are completely off the table, that this should solely be a question of gutting spending in areas like healthcare and education and basic research. The President fundamentally disagrees. His view is that there's got to be balance, and that everybody has got to contribute to make that happen. With respect to specific corporate loopholes, I think the President couldn't agree more. When he went out into the State of the Union, he said that we have, fundamentally a corporate tax system that doesn't work. It's loaded up with so many different loopholes and special interest giveaways that we're forced to have a very high statutory tax rate, and at the same time don't bring in all that much money. So the right approach is to get rid of those loopholes, to reduce the special deductions in the tax code, and look at using that savings to lower the tax rate. What that can do is actually generate investment, jobs in the United States, make us more competitive. So I think there's a real opportunity to do that. But again, as in every area of the budget, and this includes defense, what it's going to take is a serious conversation and serious commitment, because this conversation has happened in the past. And I think over the past decade, what you saw is that we lost our way a bit in Washington, and that we didn't live up to these principles. And we saw a lot of these loopholes actually expanded rather than curtailed. So I think we agree with the approach, but that's part of why we need to have a really serious process going forward.
Great. And the next question sort of goes off of that and maybe allows you to put taxes in a little bit more of a historical context. Spiffy Ark asks or suggests that we restore taxes on corporations and the wealthy to their 1950s levels.
We've got creative screen names in this conversation. Well, one of the things the President talked about today was we can't just look at the corporate tax system, as we were just talking about, but we have to look at the individual tax system as well. And I think you've seen two trends, both of which the President touched on today in this country. The first is that if you look at average tax rates, so when you put aside all of the complexities of the tax code, how much of your income are you actually spending on taxes? The richest 2% or the richest 1% or even 0.1% have seen their average tax rates fall consistently. And so we're at a level now where for the top 2%, the top 1%, their average tax burdens are at their lowest level in 50 years. At the same time, what you've seen is over the past decade, we saw a period of economic growth where for the bottom 90% of workers, average incomes actually fell. And that's the first time since World War II where we've gone through a, quote, economic expansion where the typical family's income actually declined. And so the intersection of those two factors, a declining tax burden on the most well-off and declining incomes for typical families, has put us in a somewhat unbalanced situation. And so that's what's motivating the President's call to say, we just simply can't afford to continue to extend tax cuts for the wealthiest 2% of Americans. The tax cuts that we are going to have a big debate about over the next couple of years would give the typical millionaire a tax cut of nearly $200,000. And we just simply can't afford that at a time when we have fiscal pressures, when we have education imperatives, when we need to invest in our crumbling infrastructure, and when we have middle-class families whose incomes are actually declining. So we're going to have a big debate about that in Washington, but I think the president's view is based both in the economics of the trends that we've seen and also the common sense that at a time when everybody is tightening their belt, $200,000 tax cut for millionaires who don't want them and don't need them, it just doesn't make sense.
Okay. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this one. Let's just say it's TAD. It starts with the word TAD. But changing gears, says, stop using money where it isn't necessary and use it where it is. Example, $4 billion in subsidies to oil companies. You can take that away from the $400 billion profit a year industry and use it instead to research alternative energy.
It's a great idea, and it's timely today as we see gas prices go up and affecting a lot of families in their pocketbooks at the pump. And the president a couple weeks ago went out and spoke about energy policy in this country, and one of the things that he said was that for too long we've been having a conversation about quick fixes and short-term efforts. Everybody's got their plan to try to lower gas prices over the next month or even over the next year, when at the end of the day, this is a larger structural problem in our economy, our dependence on oil and our dependence on fossil fuels. The idea of basically taking away the special tax benefits that go to oil and gas companies is one that, since the campaign, the president has been pushing, both because it makes sense from an environmental and an economic perspective. As part of the G20, the international agreement to reduce subsidies for fossil fuel as part of our efforts to affect global warming, the president made a commitment that he was going to do what he could to reduce those subsidies. It also makes sense economically because, to go back to those loopholes we were talking about, it's not good for U.S. competitiveness to have a corporate tax system where an individual company's investment decisions are made by their tax department, not by their engineers and their researchers and their creative center. So for a whole bunch of reasons, it just doesn't make sense to have these anymore. And redirecting them toward investing in the kind of long-term efforts that could actually move us toward a clean energy economy makes a lot of sense. That's what the president spoke about recently, and we're going to take a real run at trying to get something done on that this year in Washington.
Great. Okay, this one's a 5-part one, so we may have to go back through, but it touches on a few things you've already covered. So don't spend money we don't. It comes from Emotionist. Number 1, don't spend money we don't have or borrow to get out of debt. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the interest payments and sort of the impact of debt. Aid U.S. companies to compete versus Asian markets. Encourage U.S. manufacturing, not only services. Don't waste money on wars. And invest to become independent of OPEC. And I think they missed a 2, so it's really only 5 different things.
Okay. All right. Well, let me try to take them in tow. We've covered a couple of them, but I'll try to hit the others. You raise the interesting issue of deficits and debt and the interest cost that accumulates. It's not that much more complicated than a typical family and their credit card bill. And what happens, as everybody knows, is that when you get into debt and you run up a big credit card balance, then you have 2 problems. The first is you've got to stop increasing your outstanding balance. You've got to stop putting more debt on the table. And second, even if you stop doing that, you have an interest problem because you now have this big stock of debt, and that accumulates interest even if you're not adding to that debt. At the national level, we have exactly that problem. As a result of a whole set of decisions over the past decade, when the president came into office, we had a $1 trillion deficit in this country, and we had a $6 trillion debt. Now, we were also in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and we had to take a set of emergency measures that actually added temporarily to that deficit. At this point, we've stopped increasing the size of the deficits each year, and part of this plan that the President outlined today is an effort to substantially bring down the deficits each year. But part of the reason why we need to do that so aggressively is because no matter what, the large outstanding stock of debt is still going to generate interest. So this year, the typical family is paying, the interest that we're paying on our outstanding debt is about $2,500 for the typical family. But it's going to increase to about $1 trillion by 2020 if we don't do anything. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where we can't afford to just stay in place. We have to do better than that so that we can start bringing down the debt, start reducing those interest payments, and free up resources to invest more productively. So that's a big motivator behind the President's $4 trillion deficit reduction plan. I think we've talked a bit about the wars, but I would say with respect to the U.S. competitiveness and particularly the U.S. manufacturing sector, one of the interesting things about the nascent recovery that we've seen over the past year and a half is that the manufacturing sector in the United States has really helped drive that recovery. The auto industry, after going through a terrible period during the recession, has come back quite strong, and that's true for a lot of domestic manufacturing. And I think that what we're seeing is proving a lot of the critics wrong, that America still is a place where we can make things and where we can generate economic prosperity by actually manufacturing things here in the United States. But continuing that progress going forward is going to take the right policies as well, and we have fallen backwards in previous periods when we've let our eye off the ball. So the President recently named Ron Bloom, who's a close colleague of mine, to be his special assistant for manufacturing policy. And it's the first time in a while that inside the White House we have a very senior person whose job it is to think about manufacturing policy, think about the industry, and look across the entire government and help coordinate our efforts on behalf of the manufacturing industry. So I think it's an important driver of the economic recovery right now, and more broadly, it's an important metric of whether we're succeeding economically. So we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on it.
Okay. I'd say there are a few other parts. So you had the international competitiveness, so aid U.S. companies to compete versus Asian markets. Right.
So when you look at the factors that influence U.S. competitiveness, there are a set of them on the tax side. And so we've talked about some of them, getting a tax system that makes more sense and importantly actually encourages investment in the United States. Some aspects of our tax code right now actually provide an affirmative incentive for investment outside of the United States. That doesn't make a lot of sense, particularly at a time when we have such high unemployment and people are struggling here. So part of it is the corporate tax reform that the President has called for. But another big part of it too is that the reason why the U.S. has always been a magnet for job creation and for innovation, and why companies and businesses and nonprofits and a wide range of people have always wanted to come to the United States to invest and create jobs, is that we have better educated citizens. We have an infrastructure that can support different businesses, and we're at a real challenging point because other countries are moving ahead very, very quickly, and in some of these places we're standing still or moving behind. So the President in the State of the Union, I spent a lot of time talking about his vision of how we can actually win the future and out-innovate, out-educate, and out-compete the rest of the world. And part of that was a call to action because right now we're at an inflection point. And it's not clear. If we make the wrong choices, we actually could fall behind in those areas. So if you look at something like a high-speed rail system in the United States, part of that is about clean energy and moving towards cleaner sources of transportation. But part of that is putting us in a place where you don't have to go to places like China or Chile or other places around the world and see them with the newest technology that helps spur investment and commerce because people can move back and forth places more quickly. That stuff should be happening in the United States. And so we have a real challenge there, but I think in areas from education to infrastructure to basic research and innovation, those are priorities for the president in large part because we need to keep our economy competitive. I think the last one on the list, well, we've talked about the savings from ramping down overseas contingencies operations and wars abroad. And the last question was about OPEC. And again, I think that having, for the president, a strategy around reducing our dependency on foreign oil is really about acknowledging that this is a problem that Washington has been talking about for literally 30 or 40 years. Acknowledging that there are no short-term quick fixes, that we can't snap our fingers and magically bring down the price of gas. And if we did, then without any change to the political system, we'd be back into the same cycle where nothing ever gets done. So realizing that, having a serious conversation about it and taking steps like getting rid of these oil subsidies and actually reinvesting them, looking at things like establishing a clean energy standard to say we should by 2025 have at least 35% of our energy in this country generated from clean renewable sources. Those are the kind of steps that could actually over the long term move us in the right direction. And those are part of the president's plan.
Great. Well, you touched on education a little bit in your answer and wanted to move on to actually two questions that are related. The first comes from Mr. Jazzy Says, please consider fixing the debt situation with education. Why should American students be punished so harshly for seeking out an education? Some other countries even pay their young adults to attend higher education. Education should be a necessity. And then related to that comes from Nick Loves Popcorn in Texas, who says, what can be done to increase the nation's funding for education? For someone like me, my mom's job is being cut because the school districts in my city are all falling short of the money needed. A lot of the U.S. government's money is spent on nonsense.
Good points. Good points all around. I would say a couple things about education, and the president spent some time talking about education in his speech today as well. First is that this is one of those areas where the difference in vision between what the president was talking about today and what the House Republican plan has put forward, I think, is significant. What the president said when he came into office and his agenda from the beginning was that we need to reform our education system. We need more accountability. We need to get serious about reforms that have gone by the wayside for too long. But we also need to invest where our values are and where our priorities are. And so if you look over the past couple of years, a historic increase in Pell Grants, which right now give $5,500 toward higher education for lower income students in this country. The American Opportunity Tax Credit, it's the first time in our history where we have a $2,500 partially refundable tax credit that's $10,000 for 4 years for somebody to go to college, opening the doors to college by making it more affordable, and instituting reforms like the Race to the Top program, which has across this country really ignited a wave of positive reforms and accountability in our schools for relatively little federal money because we held out a competition and said you only get resources once you've actually shown and demonstrated that you can do these reforms. These are the kind of things that the president values. These are the things that are fundamental to him, and part of the reason why we have a conversation, and this goes to the second question about how can we actually invest. I think what the president was saying, for people who share his values for how our government and what our country should be, part of the reason why you have to have a conversation about fiscal discipline and about cutting the deficit is because you have to show that if you have priorities and you want to invest in those priorities, you have to show where else you're willing to cut, where else you're willing to ask more other people to sacrifice. And I think what the president was trying to show today was that if we have a balanced approach, if we ask sacrifice from everyone, including the most well-off, including in places like our security budget, then we actually can have a positive agenda for the future, where we maintain investments in things like Pell Grants. And that, I think, that's a very important reason why deficits matter, why the debt matters, is because if you aren't willing to state your priorities and state where you're going to cut, then it's hard to make arguments for where you need to invest. One last thing about the Republican plan I would say is that I think it's also important for people to know the facts. And people get lost and caught up in a lot of numbers. But the plan includes some of the harshest cuts to basic funding for education that we've seen in many years in this country. A 25% reduction in funding for education. Cutting Pell Grants, the program I talked about, cutting that $5,500 by $1,000 or more by the end of this decade. That's a cut of $4,000 for someone who's trying to go to 4 years of college. I think that understanding that those are the stakes in this debate is important because, again, this is fundamentally, this budget fight and this budget discussion is really a discussion about values. It's a discussion about priorities, and at the end of the day, that's where it comes down to.
Okay. So we're going to take one more question here, one more idea, and this is on a topic we've spent quite a bit of time over the last 2 years talking about healthcare. Right. This one comes from VidMag in Cleveland, Ohio. Address the real problem with healthcare. Other countries sell the same drugs as we do for a fraction of the costs. Doctors overbook appointments and spend 5 minutes with you, and you get paid based on quantity, not quality. And for God's sake, educate kids.
You distilled it down into a pretty pithy and effective set of priorities there. But I'm glad we got a chance to talk about healthcare because healthcare was obviously a big priority for us and was a central part of the president's speech today. We have a problem in this country that the cost of healthcare is rising too fast. That's true for prescription drugs, but it's also true for basic services that you need, as well as complicated procedures. And there are two basic ways to solve that problem. The first is to say, we are just going to shift those costs away from the federal government. Because we can't afford it as a federal government, seniors should pay more, middle-class families should pay more, the states should pay more. That's the basic approach of the House Republican plan. When you think about voucherizing a program like Medicare, what it basically says is, let's not go at the fundamental drivers of why healthcare costs is going up. Let's just shift those costs away from the federal government and on to seniors. There's a different approach which says, let's go at why it is that we have a health system where costs for everything are driving too much and actually try to reform the system. That's not an easy thing to do. We saw that in passing health reform over the last 2 years, but we did it. And that was a historic achievement that will, over the next 2 decades, generate $1 trillion in savings to our deficit by reducing the growth of healthcare costs. So it doesn't increase the burden on families and on seniors. It actually reduces costs throughout the system. What the president talked about today was, let's build on that. Let's do more. Let's be more aggressive at cutting costs. So on the issue of prescription drugs, let's use the leverage that Medicare has as a large purchaser of prescription drugs. Let's use that leverage to actually help push down costs and save money for beneficiaries. Let's do common sense things like the patient safety initiative that the president rolled out recently and is going to be implemented over the next several years, which basically says to hospitals, you will get rewarded for the degree to which you can avoid errors that happen in hospitals and errors that can actually make people sicker from coming into hospitals. It is a sad state of affairs in the country where you have to worry about people who come into the hospital actually getting sicker or getting hurt more as a result of problems that happen in hospitals. But let's reward hospitals that do the right thing and not for the other ones. Reforms like that are actually going to go at the root cause and actually going to bring down the cost of health care. And again, just to go back to where we started, if your values say that we as a country have a responsibility to provide health care to all of our citizens, that to provide a rock-solid commitment of health care to the elderly, to parents who have a child with autism or other disabilities, if we believe that that's a value, and certainly that's something that's core to the president's vision for this country, then we have a responsibility to do the hard work of reforming our healthcare system to bring down costs. The president put out another set of these ideas today. That's where he wants this conversation about saving money to be, and that's where he's going to push it going forward.
That's great. Well, thanks, Brian, for joining us,
Thank you.
and thanks everyone out there for joining us. And as Brian said, there's going to be a conversation moving forward. I think it's safe to say that we didn't solve all the problems with today's speech. I think the next few weeks we'll see increased debate and conversation, and that conversation will happen online as well. One of the things that we've put out today is on our Twitter account at White House. We have a hashtag that we're using called Future We Want, where people are able to respond to the speech, throw out some more ideas. We'll be responding to them over the next few days and weeks, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. And thanks again for tuning in. Thanks again to YouTube for hosting this Q&A and idea tool, and we look forward to doing it again.